It's time for me to buy a new project car, but with so many different options on the market, I'm struggling to choose which one is the right one for me. So today, I'm going to be looking at some of the best used dual cab utes on the market for under 30 grand. So if you're in the market for a second-hand ute as well, make sure you stay tuned because I'm going to be going through the pros and cons of each one to try and help you decide on which one's the right one to buy. So why a dual cab ute? Well, I reckon they're the perfect platform for work and play. They're easy to store gear in, and a lot of you guys watching will have a dual cab ute as well, which means I can look at a whole bunch of important mods to do to them to try and arm you guys with the right information to get your vehicle set up right as well. I want a vehicle that can do a bit of everything, you know, something that can go to Coffs Harbour and tackle all the tough tracks just as easily as it can do a month-long trip in the Kimberley. I also want something that can take a tinny down to the boat ramp on the weekends or go camping with mates, chuck a whole bunch of timber in the back, and something that can just as easily get me to work come Monday morning.
Okay, so there might be some of you thinking, why not just buy a cruiser or a patrol? And yep, for off-road capability, they would win hands down. But an IFS ute is a bit more of a challenge, so I want to see if I can make one keep up. From this build, here are some questions I want to answer. What are the limits of the dual cab ute? Can it be made into the ultimate all-rounder? Can they do everything a bigger 79 can do for a much lower total build cost? Can I get a reliable second-hand common rail and make it go the distance? What maintenance and modifications do I need to make to achieve this?
Here's the criteria I'm looking at. Firstly, it has to be a dual cab ute, as we explained. It also has to be a common rail diesel. And the reason for that is I want a vehicle with an engine in it that's indicative of what a lot of you guys have out there. Next up, it has to be an auto. You know what you're thinking, why are you going in auto? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I've already got two very modified dual cabs with manuals and reduction gears, and they work perfect. Having an auto will just give it a bit more drivability on and off road, and I really like the control that an auto gives you straight away. As well as that, chasing power out of an engine, in a lot of cases, an auto will be better to handle that. Some manual gearboxes can't quite take it if you're chasing big power. And finally, it has to be under 30 grand, as we explained, which unfortunately limits a lot of dual cab utes out there. For example, you're probably thinking maybe a 79, well, at the end of the day, I just can't afford one. So we're gonna be looking at second-hand common rails, ideally around the 200,000 kilometre mark, and I reckon that'd be bang on the money.
Here's what I've narrowed down from doing some research so far that fits the profile above. You'll notice that there are some utes that aren't here. That's mainly because I couldn't find a clean one for under 30 grand, and if there was one, it had high Ks. A few notable absences are the D-Max. That's because they hold their value so well that I couldn't get one for under 30k with the right amount of Ks on it. And the Amarok, that's not on here purely because it doesn't have a transfer case, so what I want to do with it, it probably won't be suited. The Triton has always been an attractive option for full drivers who wanted a no-bull ute on a budget. This one, the MN Triton, made its debut back in 2010 and has the 4D56 2.5 litre turbo diesel engine. You can easily pick up a low-K reasonable example of a Triton for much less than other utes on the market. Which is why I'm looking at this one first, because when I was doing my research, the Triton was ticking a lot of boxes for me. There are a few things to look out for though, so let's take a closer look.
So as I mentioned, Tritons are a really affordable option, and you can even step up to the model above this, still for under 30 grand. This one though, the MN, this trim level is a GLXR, which means that the transmission was the same one that's in the Pajero, and it's also got Mitsubishi's famous Super Select 4 drive system, which means that I can drive around in 4 high without a lock center diff, which is perfect for higher speed roads, like if you're driving up the Peninsula Development Road in Cape York, you can keep it in 4 and drive at much higher speeds with a bit more control. The 4D56 is a pretty reliable engine, but it did have a few little niggling things that you would want to sort out if you own one. A really common one is they're known to be a little bit underpowered. That is an easy fix though, with tunes, aftermarket exhausts, turbos and stuff like that. There's plenty of aftermarket support to make these engines boogie a little bit more. The predecessor to this engine was what was called the 4M41, and it was notorious for clogging up the inlet manifold from soot from the EGR. This engine does do that as well. It wasn't as bad, but it's important if you do have one to still fit a catch can, because they still can get a bit clogged up. Another thing that's really important, and this one, Lachlan from Off the Wall suggested this as well, they need a valve set ideally around every 30 to 45,000 kilometers. It's quite important on these engines to make sure that's done. Another common issue with these engines, particularly in the earlier ones, was they were prone to overheat. Mitsubishi did fix the problem, but basically the fix involved detuning them. They also did a few other things too. They put some ECU monitoring in for the cooling system, changed that and updated it. They also changed the concentration of coolant in the cooling system to a higher concentration of glycol, and they put a higher pressure release on the radiator cap. A way to tell if you're looking at one, the cap should say 127 kPa. That means it's got the higher pressure release cap on it, which generally means the cooling system has been sorted. But it's worth keeping in mind, if you're not sure, make sure the cooling system on the one you're looking at, or if you own one, is regularly maintained, and you shouldn't have a problem. Another very common issue with the Triton, and you've probably seen photos of it online, is them bending the rear chassis. Now, there are a few things that cause it, but there's also a few easy fixes for it as well. One of the main causes is overloading the rear. You can see here how much rear overhang the tub has, which means there's a lot of chassis and tub here and a lot of space that you can put gear in, and the more weight you put up here, the more stress it's going to put behind the rear axle, which means if you hit a bump with it fully loaded, it's going to put a lot of force on the poor old chassis and it can't handle it. The solutions are, well, there's two. First, don't put too much weight in the tub, that's one, it's nice and easy. And the second one is, if you're serious about it or you're worried, you can brace the chassis. There are bracing kits for these vehicles that you can put in. And if you're using your vehicle for work or loading it up for camping, if you do that, you should never have a problem. The Triton was never as popular as other dual cab utes on the market because, to be honest, it was seen as a cheaper option and a bit of an ugly duckling when it came to the design. Some people didn't like the way they looked. But the fact that you can get one of these for well under 30 grand with low Ks on it, with a few choice mods on it already, means that one of these would be the perfect option if you want a reliable work ute that you can get you to work during the week, but still be a nice comfy tourer on the weekends. I reckon the Triton is a really good buy. The RC Colorado shares the same 4JJ1 engine as the earlier model Isuzu D-Max. You can get big power out of these engines and they're super reliable. But with Holden no longer existing, is an RC Colorado a good buy, or is it going to be something that'll bite you down the track? Let's have a look.
Before we get into the RC Colorado, you're probably wondering why its later model, the RG Colorado, isn't in this comparison. Well, the reason for that is we reckon, quite simply, the RC Colorado is a better buy with that 4JJ1 engine. Yes, it has a slightly outdated suspension design, but we reckon that engine more than makes up for it if you're looking for a reliable ute you can get decent power out of.
One of the main issues with the RC Colorado was the fact that it used torsion bar independent front suspension. Most vehicles nowadays use a coil and strut, whereas this one has this long steel bar here which is connected to the lower control arm. This is torsional steel, similar to what you'd find in a sway bar, and the way it works is when you hit bumps, this will essentially twist. You've got an adjuster at the back here to wind them up, and that's in often cases what will give you your lift. You can replace these torsion bars with heavier duty ones and wind them up to suit. The problem is that'll give you a much more stiffer ride, and in often cases this adjuster can seize, which means it's really hard to get these out. So this suspension design, while it works okay, it's somewhat limited. Another issue with the RC Colorado suspension is this here. This is called spring under suspension, and it basically means that the spring pack is sitting underneath the diff housing. And that can present a few clearance issues because this will be the first thing you'll hit off road. It's also really common in 79 series Land Cruisers. One of the main reasons they get hung up so much is because they've got big spring packs that sit underneath the diff, and then this section here, the spring hanger, is what gets caught up. There are solutions for it. You can flip the U-bolts around and put the plate on the other side. You can get low profile plates to give you a bit more clearance, and in some cases you can do what's called a spring over conversion, which is basically where you put the spring pack on the top of the diff. That was really common on old 60 series Land Cruisers and stuff, so there are solutions out there to fix this, but it's definitely an issue, and you'll find if you have a standard height RC Colorado, you'll probably get hung up a fair bit on this section here. Apart from those minor issues with the suspension, the RC Colorado is a real good option if you're looking for a reliable, honest dual cab ute. But it's worth keeping in mind though, with Holden no longer existing, in a few years you might find you'll struggle to get genuine parts. Not right now though, you're still pretty good with getting parts for them, and that's where the aftermarket industry will really come into its own with keeping these things running. Another thing too is they don't quite hold their value as some of the other utes on the market. It won't fetch a pretty price if you try and resell it, but that said, if you're after a no-bull, reliable work ute, Colorado's a good option.
The N70 Hilux was and is still one of the most popular second-hand utes on the market. They're reliable, tough, hold their value, you can get good power out of the engine, and second-hand parts are everywhere for them. But with such a demand for them, they can fetch a premium price. So are they just hype or a solid option for a second-hand ute?
A really good thing about the N70 Hilux is there's lots of different options on the market, which means you can find one pretty easily to suit your needs and budget. As I mentioned, parts are very easy to source as well. For example, these Hiluxes shared some similarities with their predecessors. The rear diff center didn't change in Hiluxes from 1980, late 80s to 2010, which means if you blow a rear diff in the middle of nowhere, you can probably get one. There's just little things like that. You can also get good power out of the engine. The 1KD, people are getting over 200 horsepower out of them without too much trouble when they're paired with an auto for reliability. Another thing to consider is Hilux's strength. They're known for it, and sure, they're not as strong as their predecessors, the ones that were built in Japan like the Pony, but I have never seen someone push a modern dual cab ute as hard as a Hilux has been pushed. They still brake for sure, just like every four-wheel drive when you push them too hard, but from my experience and what we've seen over the years is N70 Hiluxes compared to vehicles of a similar era, you just can push that little bit harder. So if you're planning to do some tougher tracks, this might be the one for you. Some of the cons with the N70, and there are a few of them, first one being price. There's a thing called the Toyota tax, which applies to pretty much every second-hand Toyota on the market. It's because they're built so well, and people know that when they're selling them, so the price is jacked up. When it comes to the engine in this, the 1KD FTV, it's a 3-litre 4-cylinder common rail turbo diesel. It did have a few issues, particularly in the earlier model. Had issues with injector seals failing, which would cause carbon buildup in the oil, which could block the oil pickup and starve your engine of oil without you even knowing it, because you'd be changing your oil normally and you wouldn't know that the pickup was blocked. So if you have an earlier one, every now and then when you do an oil change, stick a torch in through the sump drain hole and check that the oil pickup is clean, or you may have to take the sump off. You do hear horror stories of them cracking pistons as well, but there's speculation out there that a lot of that is to do with the injection system, and if your injectors are in poor quality and they're not atomizing the fuel and there's excess heat going on, that can cause pistons to crack. So what I'm getting at is keep on top of your injectors if you have one of these vehicles. Another minor issue with these vehicles is they lacked some of the creature comforts that vehicles of similar ages did, and that's because the N70 went right up to 2015 when it was overtaken by the N80, the new model to come out, which meant in the tail end of their life, they were a bit long in the tooth, and other utes were coming out with things like factory rear diff locks, CarPlay and all those nice things that people have. Speaking of rear diffs, Hiluxes of this variant had an 8-inch rear center, which when you're chasing a fair bit of power out of them, they have been known to fail, so it's something to keep in mind. There is one more thing to consider with Hiluxes and Toyotas in general. It's the build quality. After 10 years of opening and shutting the door, it'll still shut nicely. It's the fact that the trim clips, when you take the dash apart to put something behind the dash, they seem to last that little bit longer. It's all those little things that Toyota have gotten right after years of building tough, reliable workhorses. If you're just after a vehicle that you can push that little bit harder and you're happy to pay a little bit more for one that's got some higher Ks, I reckon a Hilux is still the best option.
Guys, just wanted to interrupt for 2 seconds because we've got some really exciting news. Now, everyone loves a bargain and they don't get much better than this, because right now on the 4WheelDrive247.com website, you can save up to 50% off. That's huge savings to be found at the end of financial year savings. So for people like you and me, it basically means we need to clear a bit of space on our shelves, and now's the time to save an absolute packet. So jump on the website right now so you don't miss out. This is your last opportunity. Do yourself a favour, kit your truck out with all the best gear that we use on the 4WheelDrive247.com website.
The D40 Navara used to be a super popular option for four-wheel drivers, but as the years have gone on, we're starting to see a few less of them on the tracks. That said though, you can still get an absolute bargain if you find the right one. It's important to note though that they came with two variants. Some of them were built in Spain and some of them were built in Thailand. The general consensus is the Thai-built ones were a bit better, which I guess when you think about it makes sense, because a lot of dual cab utes these days are coming out of Thailand. So with that in mind, let's have a closer look and see what we can find. The engine in the D40 is a YD25. It's a 2.5 litre 4-cylinder common rail turbo diesel. They also came out with a V6 diesel as well, which absolutely rips, but this one is much more common. There were a few niggling issues with this engine though. One of the notorious ones was the issue with the timing chain. They had a single row timing chain which was prone to stretching, and if that happens, being an interference engine, it means that valves can hit pistons and it's a bad time. The fix for it though is quite easy and it's very common to do. It's when you do it, you can upgrade to a double row timing chain, which gives you much more reliability. Another issue they had was the EGR cooler would often split and fail, and it means that it could leak coolant pretty much into the engine and it would try and combust coolant, which obviously doesn't combust very well, but also in other ways it can just leak out. It gave similar issues in extreme cases to a bad head. You could be losing coolant and overheating, blowing smoke and carrying on and stuff like that. Fortunately, it's a well-known issue and the EGR cooler is a common and pretty straightforward thing to replace. So up the front here, this is a minor issue, but it's well known about and it's easy to fix. In fact, it's pretty much solved on this one, but you can see that the radiator hangs just a little bit lower than the chassis at the front, which means it can be prone to getting hit on things. Fortunately, you can just get a bash plate over it. This bull bar pretty much protects it nicely, but it's definitely something to keep in mind if you're looking at a Navara that doesn't have a bull bar or any bash plates on it. Another thing to keep in mind with the D40s is they had quite a big tail shaft that was made of alloy. It's not a massive issue by any means, but it's definitely worth keeping in mind because it's quite big and in the way. If you're out on some tougher tracks, you might accidentally hit it, and because it's alloy, it's not as strong as steel, you could break it a bit easier. Again, not a deal breaker, but definitely something to keep an eye on. While the D40 Navara isn't as popular as it used to be, it definitely means that there could be some bargains to be had out there if you know what to look for. Just make sure the model you're looking at has had those little niggling issues sorted, particularly the timing chain and that EGR cooler. As well as that, see if you can find one that was built in Thailand, as from our experience, they seem to be a little bit better made than the Spain-built ones. Other than that, if you're out for a bargain, the D40 might be a good option for you. The Ford Ranger has been an extremely popular choice for four-wheel drivers, and it's pretty easy to see why. They're big, comfortable, pretty reliable, powerful, and they've got heaps of aftermarket support available as well. In fact, right now, the current Ford Ranger is going toe-to-toe with the new Toyota Hilux for the top-selling car in the country. But with that in mind, let's have a look at the pros and cons of the earlier model Rangers like this one, the PX1, to try and help you decide if one of these is right for you. The engine in the Ford Ranger is a 3.2 litre 5-cylinder, the DuraTorque. It's the same one that's in the model of BT-50 we're looking at. Pretty good engine, had lots of aftermarket support. For example, this one's got a custom airbox, and over here is a big one. The factory intercooler hose on these Rangers commonly split. This one's already been upgraded as well. That's where it's really important. There's a couple of little things on these engines like that intercooler hose that's important to upgrade. Some of the problems with the PX1 Ranger and the BT-50 lie in the gearbox and in the automatic transmission. I know earlier I mentioned that I was looking at an automatic. This one's a manual, so I just wanted to talk about some of the problems they had. There are two bearings in the gearbox. There's one on the cluster shaft and one on the input shaft. Those bearings can harden and fail, which means if they do, you're up for a new gearbox. They do have a service life as well. I believe it's around about 80,000 Ks, so if you're looking at a Ranger or a BT-50 with a manual gearbox and it's over that threshold, you might want to check to see if any gearbox problems have ever come up. If you're not sure, you can always drain a little bit of oil out of the gearbox. Firstly, check it's clean, because it means it's been serviced regularly, and check that there's no metal in there. There are upgrade options available as well. There's a company called 360 Gearbox and Diff down in Melbourne, and they do a tow pack upgrade, which means that you can get the bearings sorted out, and if you're doing any heavy towing or putting your vehicle under a lot of load with a manual, it's well worth considering if you're worried about your gearbox's longevity. An important thing to note with these engines is they have what's called a variable pressure oil pump. And what that means is, when you're changing the oil, if you drain all the old oil out, before you put new stuff in, if you leave it for too long, the oil pump won't be able to prime the engine with oil, and it means when you start it up, you can actually ruin the engine. Sounds like a big deal, but it's well known and it's easy to deal with. When you're servicing them, it just is a case of doing the oil change quickly, which is easy. Just drain the old oil, whack a new filter on, fill it with oil, and you're good to go.
The BT-50 I reckon is one of the most underrated utes out there. It shares the same DNA as the Ford Ranger in this series, but didn't carry the same price tag. There are heaps of aftermarket accessories for it, just like the Ranger, and you can get decent power out of them for towing. Also, it has one of the highest payloads of its class for this generation of dual cabs, which means if you're a tradie, this may just be the perfect ute for work.
Because they share the same DNA as the Ford Ranger, it means they also share the same niggling issues. With the engine, that variable pressure oil pump still exists in this engine, and like we mentioned with the Ranger, it's not a big deal as long as you mitigate it and change the oil quickly. The main concerns with the BT-50 were, if you've got a manual one, those bearings on the input shaft and the cluster shaft we mentioned with the Ranger, but if you've got an automatic like this one, it's worth keeping an eye on its temperatures. One of the biggest problems with the transmissions in the BT-50 and the Ranger as well is they fail due to heat. We spoke to the experts at Wholesale Automatic Transmissions and they said almost every single problem with the transmissions in these vehicles can be traced back to them getting hot at one stage or another. And the reason for that is the way they're cooled from factory, they don't have an external transmission cooler. They use a heat exchanger on the side of the transmission, which uses coolant from the engine's cooling system to cool the transmission. What that means is it's using hot coolant to cool the transmission. As well as that, there's a restrictor inside the system which isn't very reliable, and that restrictor won't open the whole way if it fails, which means not only are they trying to be cooled by hot coolant, sometimes it's not getting enough of it, and that can cause the transmission to overheat and fail. The simple fix for it is to fit an aftermarket transmission cooler. It's worth keeping in mind if you are looking at one of these and you're just going to be using it for daily driving, you're not going to be loading it up too much, you could probably get away with the factory cooling system on the transmission. But if you're planning to work your vehicle hard, put bigger tyres on it, tow a heavy load, or take it on the beach or something like that, you may find that fitting an aftermarket transmission cooler will go a long way to keeping your transmission reliable. Further to that, if you're looking at one second hand and you know it's done some heavy towing, for example, there are telltale signs that it has been used for towing, like old mate's got a caravan parked behind it, or there's a brake controller or an Anderson plug on the back, check to see if it's got an aftermarket transmission cooler. Not that it may have any transmission problems, but it could mean that it's gotten hot at one point or another, and it may be something you'll have to deal with down the track. Now, just like my mother likes to tell me before I go on a hot date with a lady, appearance isn't everything. And with the BT-50, a lot of people didn't like them because of their design, particularly the front end. Some people thought looked a little bit funky. But with a bit of bar work on them, I reckon they actually can be made to look pretty tough. So if you like the design and you're after a reliable, no-bull tradie work ute that can carry a lot of weight and has a good power engine, or something that you can get good power out of anyway, I reckon the BT-50 is definitely worth considering. And for me, I'm seriously considering one of these. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for them, maybe because they're a bit of an ugly duckling. We've had a look at a few different utes on the market that are in my budget, and the three that stand out to me the most are the Triton, the BT-50 and the Hilux. So let's take a closer look. I reckon the thing I like most about the Triton is the fact that you can get one with low kilometres and a later model variant for much less than a higher kilometre variant of one of the more popular utes. These would be perfect if you want a reliable ute to get you to work during the week and something that you can still go camping with your mates on the weekend or go touring in. Unfortunately, the thing that lets it down for me is the suspension design. I came really close to getting a Triton and I actually really like them. But the problem is, with the suspension design in the front, the way the control arms are set up, they're quite low on the chassis and you're limited to around 50 mil of lift with the suspension. If you want to go higher or you want to get some quite big tyres under there, you've got to do some major modifications to get it to work. Earlier model Tritons, you can do a solid axle swap. In fact, there are a few getting around and they're absolute weapons. But with later models like this, you'll struggle with engineering. The other minor issues with the Triton, like the power and the rear chassis, are both fixable. You can do plenty of different power upgrades to these engines to make them work for you, and brace the rear chassis, or be conscious of how much you're putting in the tub and you'll never have a problem. If you are looking for a low kilometre budget ute that's nice and reliable, will get you to work comfortably during the week and is perfect to take away on a weekend, for me, hands down, I would take the Triton. Next up, we've got the BT-50. I've actually always really liked these. They've got a high payload from factory, they're cheaper than their cousins the Ranger, and I reckon bang for buck, they're a really good option. To be perfectly honest, I'm actually having a really hard time finding reasons not to get one of these, which means that if I find one for the right price, the right Ks, that's in good condition, I reckon it'd be crazy not to get one. I reckon they're that good of an option. If you're looking at one of these and you want to tow a caravan, a tradie work trailer, or a camper trailer, fit an aftermarket transmission cooler so you can avoid those overheating transmission issues we described earlier. If you're looking at a manual, keep an eye out for those issues with the bearings in the gearbox. Other than that, I reckon the BT would be the perfect tradies ute. A powerful engine, a high payload, and a no frills interior means that these are perfect for the job site. And finally, we have the N70 Hilux. On paper, this is not the best choice. And to be honest, if you're looking for a comfortable and reliable daily driver and occasional weekend camping warrior, I reckon I'd still choose the Triton over one of these. But for me personally, the Hilux still ticks a lot of boxes and is definitely one to consider. I know them like the back of my hand, and if I get a model from 2010 and earlier, it means that if I find the limits of the suspension, I can look into a solid axle swap. That said though, I can do that with a lot of the other utes as well if I get an earlier model one. Another thing to consider if you are looking at one of these is because there are so many of these out there, second-hand parts are readily available, which means even though you'll pay a higher price for one with more Ks on it than say a Triton, you can probably pick up some bargains on the second-hand marketplace for cheap to help you get your build started.
Some of you may think I'm being a bit biased here, and fair enough. I do like Hiluxes even though it's clearly not the best choice value for money wise. There are lots of better utes out there to consider, but for what I want to do with it, I'd be worried that I can't push any of the others like I know I can push a Hilux. What do you reckon? Am I making the right call, or do you think I should get something different? Let us know what you would get in the comments below.
Hopefully this video has helped you if you're in the market for a dual cab ute and you're not sure which model to go for. We've only looked at a couple of different options. There are lots to choose from. So at the end of the day, it comes down to what vehicle is right for you and what you want to use the vehicle for. Next episode, I'm going to head out and buy my new dual cab ute. Then we're going to bring it back to the workshop and go through it front to back to show you what to look out for if you're in the market for a second-hand modern dual cab ute. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.